Thanks, Jamal, and thank you for your presentation. Yes, I'm Miranda Bernard. I'm a fifth year student in the Environmental Life Sciences program, which is in the School of Life Sciences. And I'm the co-president of the Black Graduate Student Association at ASU. So I'm going to kind of keep this a little casual. I do not like public speaking, and I presented for my department last week, and my niece hit her head right as I was starting. So I'm hoping this will go better than that. um, all right, let me share my screen. So this is a portion of my dissertation research. Let's see. Should be able to see my screen. And so broadly, my dissertation research is on the role of community engagement in marine protected areas, and a little bit about how that ended up being what I studied is I was broadly interested in marine conservation. I started grad school, didn't really know what I wanted to study. I had an idea, but after about 3 weeks, it completely shifted. And then it shifted about 5 more times. And basically, just through reading, I started to narrow down what I was interested in. And so, so marine protected areas are just set aside pieces of the sea that have some sort of like restriction or regulations on what activities can be done in them. So often it's related to fishing. So you may not be able to fish there certain times of the year, or you may not be able to fish with certain gear. Maybe there's no tourism activities. There's just some degree of restrictions in the protected area. And historically, they weren't performing as well as people expected them to be. They were supposed to be a chance for fish to repopulate and grow in numbers, but that wasn't really happening. And so there are questions about, okay, maybe they're not in the right area, or maybe they're not big enough. But ultimately, a large part of what it came down to were the human dimensions of the protected areas and issues related to the governance and how they were formed, their funding, the capacity of staff. So you can't just create a protected area on paper and not follow through with it. We call that a paper park. Um, and another reason people believe them not to do as well is because of a lack of community engagement. And community engagement, I think, across disciplines is something that we hear a lot. And it's just this broad term, but there's not really any information on what it is or what constitutes good community engagement, because there's plenty of community engagement that is not productive and that is not good for communities. It can be extractive, but it's just used in this very general sense. Another aspect of the community engagement that interests me is the fact that when we talk about community, it's one used in like a very general, uniform way, as in the community has this idea, but we know that communities are made up of individuals. And we know individuals in our own communities do not always think, behave, perceive things in the same way as each other. The second thing that was interesting is that when we talk about community engagement in the marine conservation space, it's often stakeholders who have power in the community are the ones who are engaged, or the ones who are directly related to the marine environment. So this is most commonly fishermen or tourism operators, people with a direct stake in that marine space. But in coastal communities, this marine ecosystem is something that's relevant for everyone. Everyone uses it. Everyone has some connection to it, yet not everyone is consulted in any form of engagement. And so for this chapter, I was in a small coastal fishing community, and I'll get to that, but I was interested in perceptions of environmental changes in this community to kind of see how it overlapped or conflicted with what was being done by the government and the local NGO in the region. So a little bit more about perceptions. Perceptions refer to the way an individual observes, understands, interprets, or evaluates some sort of object, an action, an experience, a policy. It can really be anything. Um, and so to my study site, uh, most all of my research has been done across the Caribbean. Um, it's a lot of different cultures and a long history of colonization that's influenced the area, and especially the way that conservation is conducted in these regions. And specifically, I look at Trinidad and Tobago, which is this boot-shaped island right off of the coast of Venezuela. At one point, or a few points across time, it was connected to Venezuela. So ecologically, it's really interesting because there's this blend of species and that are from the South American continent, but also those that are part of the Antilles, which is the chain of islands throughout the Caribbean. There's also a lot of nutrient input from the Orinoco River, which is one of the biggest rivers in South America, and its outflow is off the coast of Venezuela, and that reaches the waters around Trinidad, this island, and Tobago, the second island. A little bit about the culture of the areas. It changed hands over 30 times between the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British. So it's got a really, crazy history, and it's reflected in the society today from everything from religion to food, even the names of the towns. Like the legacy of those is very apparent. And so this is a closer look of the island of Tobago. This southwestern end here, you can see like these brown patches are development. But then when you look at the northeast, it's just green. And the reason for this is because this whole patch of green is a protected forest, and it's the oldest legally protected tropical forest in the world. It was established in 1776. So right as the US was becoming a state, so was this forest. And the reason it came about was because the island had been divided up into large agricultural estates for tobacco, indigo, cotton, and sugarcane. And so a lot of the island was deforested, and people were soon realizing that this was reducing the water availability to irrigate crops. And that had the consequences because they also needed water to power the water wheels that were used to crush sugar cane. And so there's this long tie of understanding the connections between the environment and their livelihoods, which at this point was not the livelihoods of the people who are now there today, the descendants, but of the owners of the estates. And so for this northeastern part is where I focus, and I look specifically at this town of Charlottesville, which is along this bay. So throughout the northeastern, there's just about a dozen. There's a road that goes around the island, and there's a dozen communities that are pretty small in size, probably range between a few dozen to like max 2,000 people in each community, but they're all set along the water. And so there's this strong tie between the marine ecosystem and these communities. And this is a closer look at Charlottesville, Tobago. You can see it's just a bunch of houses in the hills, a field. There's lots of different sort of government services. There's a public library here, a police station, like a health services center. Most people work for the government in some capacity. And then it's also a large fishing village. So there's probably about 30 boats owned by people in the community. There's probably about 1,000 people total in the community too. And you can see this all this forest is just that protected forest. And so they try to have this system of, protecting from ridge to reef. So from the forest to the coral reefs. And so I was looking at how residents in a small coastal fishing community perceive and characterize environmental changes and threats. And so working with a local nonprofit called Environmental Research Institute Charlottesville, which does a lot of community work in the area, and it's made up of community members. And so one of the first questions I asked was just generally like trying to get an understanding of how the village has changed over time. And a lot of the responses had to do with development and growth. So this was changes related to the loss or creation of buildings. There's one building in particular that was being built at the time I spent most of my time in the community. And, it doesn't have, people weren't associating that with the environment, but that creation of that building, which was largely perceived as negative, had major environmental implications, because in the construction of roads, buildings, anything, there's a lot of sedimentation and a lot of water, like polluting of the water, basically, which affects the coral growth. There were also a lot of discussions about the changes in the social dynamics of the community. So many people were talking about how younger people today are, not the same as they used to. There used to be more ties between families within the community. So, a neighbor would maybe discipline someone else's kid because there's this community raising of children, and it's not just the individual families raising their own children, but it's really a community service. And so we kind of see that coming about in different ways, where there's this breakdown in this more individualism within the community. So we see that as well in the fishing community. So where they used to have this practice called lend hand. So let me show you. This picture is an example. Someone has their net and they ask people to come help them and lend a hand to help bring in the catch. This was practice that was done a lot historically, but now it's more people just looking out for their own harvest, and not as much as this community, what's good for you is good for all of us mentality. So when we talked about changes to the environment more generally, some of the major things that came up were changes in biodiversity, so reflection of the changes in the quantity or diversity of wildlife and plants. There's ones that stem from both anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic drivers. Changes in the weather patterns. So something you'll hear a lot is that there used to be differentiated dry and rainy seasons, but now not so much. And there's just no consistency and not as much as a pattern. So rain in the dry season and it'll be dry in the rainy season. And then pollution is a major topic that comes up in the community, especially by the environmental NGO, but not as much as these other issues when we look at the community. And so when we look at pollution specifically, there's still, so this bottom axis I forgot to mention, this is like the number of mentions across conversations of these categorized threats. And so we'll still see a lot of people mentioning that there's no pollution, but often when the people who said that there was no pollution, what they were alluding to the fact that there sometimes is pollution, but there are people whose jobs it is to deal with the pollution. So a lot of people have government jobs where they pick up trash on the side of the road, or they do like greening of this community. So working with the like the beautification of the area. And so it's not how I would consider no pollution. So it's pollution, but there's no pollution in the sense that it's not a problem because there are people there to pick up after it. But some major sources we see are litter, yacht sewage, um, uh, village sewage. So one example, if you look in this picture, there's this pipe, and that's just coming from someone's house, probably the wastewater from their shower, from their laundry, from their kitchen sink. And that water comes into this box drain, and then that box drain flows into the coral reefs. And so one thing that came up with a conversation with one woman is that they used to have one soap, and it was more environmentally friendly, but now you can't even get that soap in the town. So we can kind of see the impacts of globalization and capitalism playing out in this community, where no one even wants these other soaps, but they're what's given to them and what's available in the local stores is these newer soaps that have a bigger impact on the environment. Another interesting one, where we can see the disconnect in perceptions from community members and the local NGOs in yacht sewage. So this is a beautiful town, and most of the tourism comes in the form of yachts. So people, mostly from Europe, um, staying on yachts just in the bay of this region. I'm not sure if I have I may have a photo later on. Um, but they're staying in this area, and they don't engage that much when they come because their housing, their food, most of their what they need is available on their own yacht. So they don't need to engage with the community in any way, except when it comes to waste. So a large reason people come to land is to throw away their trash, but yachts legally have to empty their sewage a certain amount of miles off the coast. But many people in the community believe that they're not doing this, and that it's a big problem and a big source of pollution. And for that reason, they're not people in the community don't go into the water as much as they used to, because they feel that it's contaminated, that's not safe. And so it's greatly impacting their relationship with the water, whether it's for themselves or for their children, restricting their access. But if you talk to the local nonprofit, what you'll find is that this isn't as much of a problem, and that they've tested for fecal matter, and they do regular checks, and that it's not a big issue. But there's this large disconnect. And so if you have a local NGO who says they're working on environmental issues, and one of your biggest issues is something that they're not working on, for whatever reason, there's going to be this disconnect and um, this source of possible distrust between the two entities, because it's like, if you're not looking out for what we're saying is the problem, then what are you doing here? I just thought I'd have this picture up because I really like it, and it brings back good memories. There used to be a lot of cocoa plantations on the islands, and they have a lot of cultural significance to people in the community. But in the 1960s, there was a hurricane that wiped out a lot of their agricultural industries, and that they haven't recovered since then, but they're still present in there. This is part of their heritage festival. So on that time of the year in the summer, people go out and they dance the cocoa. So, they're dancing on these beans, which isn't necessary, but it makes them really shiny, and that's a characteristic of the beans that would come from Tobago. But some of my other observations from this work was there's differences between the men and the women in the community. A lot of the responses of women were more tied to their traditional gender roles than the responses of men. Women were also more likely to bring up pollution than men, and especially in the discussion of yacht waste. The sentiment behind some of these environmental issues was a fear of the health implications. And so there's this very big understanding in the community that these environmental issues are health are their health issues. So things like air pollution, more cars in the town, that's bad for people with asthma in the town. Um, and so there was a lot of like disgust over the fact that other people's actions were impacting their and their children's health. Another important thing to think about when we're looking at perceptions is looking at scale. So there's a lot of environmental threats that are small scale and some that are large at scale. By that I mean something like household pollution is on the more local scale, whereas things like climate change, that's more of a global scale. And so our actions for what we as community members or what we as NGOs can do, our actions have to match those scales, and understanding what your results from those actions are going to look like and what scale those results are going to be as well. I guess those were the main things I wanted to bring up for this research. So thank you. And thank you to the residents and my friends in Charlottesville and my lab and my school for some funding.
May I ask a question? Sorry, my hand raise is not working, so I'm just going to go right ahead and ask. So that was very interesting. And I'm not familiar with environmental research, but in the area of health research, community-based participatory research is very important and gaining important for health disparities research especially. Now, can you give an example of the process of how you would engage the community and what the concerns are? For example, in my own field, it would be like, we'll create a focus group and ask them, oh, do you mind if we take a skin biopsy? Are you afraid that someone might use your genetic information for ill will, that kind of thing? So can you give an example of the process of community engagement in your field?
Yeah, so as I said before, community engagement is super broad. So it could be anything from like a media awareness campaign, a radio ad, focus groups, a lot of town hall meetings that are common for marine conservation. But I guess the main thing, so in terms of like best practices, is having community engagement at all steps of the process. So like before you even decide that you want to do a skin biopsy, for example, working with people in the community to see what they're interested in, like what are the questions, like what are the problems that could be solved, what are the ways of going about it, so that we're developing the research with people in the community. And that I think like transparency is a big thing. So it's like, what are the outcomes of this research, and what are reasonable things that we can expect to outcome? So like not making big promises, and just being transparent about like what are feasible outcomes, like what do you want and how can I help you? In protected areas, like they are legally, they're really hard to establish, and it takes a lot of energy, and it takes people really pushing for them. And so that's an area where we see some disconnect, is it so draining, and it's often just done by a few people in a region to try to get through a protected area. And so sometimes people will say, well, community engagement can happen later because there's just not enough capacity to get what needs to be done, which kind of goes back to like what Jamal was saying, was like, we need more people in there, and like more, only so much work can get done by like two people trying to manage a protected area. And so that's kind of a main reason why in marine conservation, at least, like community engagement like falls off, is because there's just not enough people, and it is like a time consuming process. But at the same time, like if you're engaging with the community, but then maybe you have more people invested and willing to lend a hand.
Thank you.
So it looks like we are just about at time. We have time for one more question if anybody else has any questions for Miranda. If not, then we are going to actually transition into our lunch phase. And so we will actually be returning at 1. Please come back, use the same link. For our next panel discussion at 1 p.m., we'll be talking to the Black Gay Research Group panel discussion on the importance of diversity in research in STEM, equity, and sustainability. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you at 1 p.m.